All around the world, an increasing number of people are keeping reptiles as pets. But there's a problem. These are incredibly specialised animals with very specific needs that need to be met if they're to truly thrive in captivity. Unfortunately, not many people are getting this right. No matter what kind of reptile you're keeping, the only way to understand its needs in captivity is to understand the incredible wild places that have shaped them over millions of years. These animals are works of art forged in the furnace of nature, and their accommodation should reflect that. So here's what we're going to do. Together, we're going to travel around Australia, and we're going to search for inspiration to bring the best possible reptile accommodation to life. People say that we live in crazy times, and it's kind of hard to argue with that. But I think one of the reasons we've found ourselves in this position is that we've forgotten that we too are wild creatures with needs that are rooted in the quirks of our own evolution. I'm actually just as interested in human evolution as I am in that of reptiles, so there's a chance we might cover that on our travels as well. Now, for our first reptile, we're going to cover the bearded dragon, one of the most commonly held species. But to do the bearded dragon justice, we're going to have to head out that way, a long way out that way. Our mission on this trip will be no less than to redefine the best enclosure possible for a bearded dragon, so it's going to be necessary to look at Australia in a different way. We're all familiar with this map, but there are other ways of looking at it. Take for example the boundaries of Indigenous nations. Over 250 exist here, each with unique languages, culture and law. For our purposes, we're going to interpret the continent with an overlay used in science. This is the IBRA-7. It separates the land into different bioregions with unique geology, climate and ecology. This journey will take us to a bioregion that perfectly aligns with the inland bearded dragon's natural range. It's also quite famous in terms of outback history. We're heading out to Channel Country. I really do like to reflect on what we have in common with other animals. Perhaps in the search for the best home for a bearded dragon, we might learn a little more about ourselves. One thing that fascinates me about humans is just how important our sense of self is. We really do need to know where we fit in the social order. It's absolutely critical to our well-being. It's true that the bearded dragon has some limited social skills. All of the arm waving and head bobbing that you see them do, they're all social interactions, but they are designed to live almost exclusively alone, and that's how we're different. We evolved on the Great Rift Valley in Africa. We're apes, highly social apes, and because of the importance of our social bonds, our brains are designed almost exclusively to assess our positions within a social hierarchy. The desire to reach a high position in the social order can even drive people to attempt things completely beyond their capabilities. I'm hoping soon to reach the Dig Tree, where the incompetent explorer Robert O'Hara Burke famously met his death during his catastrophically managed expedition in 1861. Despite this, he has posthumously developed the status of a kind of national hero, although to call someone a Burke remains a classic Australian insult. Anyway, we're here to think about bearded dragons, and guess who just showed up by the road? Another one. Beautiful. I always make a habit of stopping for these guys because far too many of them wind up part of the scenery, squashed onto the road. and not everyone takes the time to avoid them, unfortunately. Let you go over here, big fella. As we head west beyond the Mulga lands, we find ourselves right in the middle of the Channel Country bioregion. It stretches across 150,000 square kilometres of Australia's arid interior, across multiple states. The majority is in far western Queensland. From here, the land sweeps out into massive catchments reaching into the Northern Territory, all of it draining into the Salt Lake and Sand Dune country of South Australia. The southern portion even reaches into New South Wales, where there are some unusual geological features, and it's here that I think we'll really get warmer in our search for the inspiration for our ultimate bearded dragon enclosure. But for now, it's time to just find a nice spot to camp for the night. There's a spot I've been checking out on the map, and I think it's going to be just perfect for our bearded dragon build. Should get there tomorrow, and when we do, we'll get some images and absorb what we can about the site for inspiration, and then we'll get back to the factory for the build. To understand the story of how the bearded dragon evolved on this continent, we have to travel back in time around 60 million years. At this point, Australia is still connected to Antarctica. This is the final stage in the disintegration of the supercontinent Gondwana. It's hard to imagine now, but the entire landmass at that time was rainforest. At this point, there were no lizards from the dragon family here. There were the ancestors of today's skinks, monitors, and geckos, but no dragons. By around 50 million years ago, the continent broke free from Antarctica and began its slow drift northwards. As it moved, the climatic patterns around the continent changed and it began to dry out. Great swaths of rainforest in the interior giving way to casuarina forests and then deserts. As our continental shelf crashed into Asia, agamid or dragon lizards, which had evolved in China, began to spread through Southeast Asia and then rafted here on floating debris across the narrow straits of the Timor Sea. There were few animals occupying the niches of the newly formed deserts at that stage, and when the dragons arrived they evolved rapidly into dozens of new species, 72 of which still exist across the continent today, including the bearded dragon.
Oh, what? That's been in there all night. Did I mention this is the Cooper Creek of Burke and Wills fame? Robert O'Hara Burke died just over there, about 50 metres away, under a coolabah tree back in 1861. Now, I was hoping to catch a big pot of yabbies to demonstrate how much of a dumb goose he was to die here of starvation when surrounded by food. Seems I wouldn't have done much better. Where's that stick of dynamite?
We're heading into Dune country today, and we'll need to make some last-minute alterations to the ride in the name of travelling safely in this part of the world. Passing through this beautiful dune country now. I have to say it is absolutely stunning. The place I want to get to for our bearded dragon inspiration for our enclosure build is a bit further south. It's called the Timelapse Dome. It's quite unusual in this part of the world because it's one of the few incursions of metamorphic rock forcing its way up to the surface. As we move south beyond the dunes of the Strzelecki Desert, our destination nears. It's the Timelapse Dome, a 500 million year old chunk of igneous rock peeking out of the desert landscape. Move over, guys. That's the way. Oh. Always a straggler. The dome is 10 kilometres across. I'm hoping to find a small outcrop of granodiorite rock within this area with just the right look to form the basis of our enclosure build. A few days before I commenced this trip, my mum passed away following a battle with Alzheimer's. I'm experiencing a primal kind of grief that cannot be outrun, but I also have a strange feeling that she is guiding me on this journey. I'm not a religious man, but the idea that we live on somehow, whether in spirit or simply in memory, is a beautiful notion either way. This way of seeing the world seems to have been a feature of humanity from our earliest times. I don't see this as a matter separate to our evolution, but as an inextricable feature of it. I think I found what I'm looking for. That's just over here.
might say these rocks have had a slightly longer journey than we have. When they were formed in the Cambrian period, 500 million years ago, there were no lizards. There were no vertebrate animals at all. And this so-called land down under was at that time in the northern hemisphere. I think they make a fantastic backdrop for our build, and I can't wait to get back to the factory and get stuck into it. All right, folks, we've reached about the halfway point in the build, and it's probably time we caught up and I talked you through what is going on here. Before we do, I'd like to talk a little bit about the problems I see with the enclosures that most people wind up with for their bearded dragons. And the biggest mistake most people make is to buy their bearded dragon enclosure where they buy their bearded dragon, in a pet shop. You'll almost invariably wind up with a 3 or 4 foot tank. Now these are very active arboreal lizards with large home ranges, and keeping them in a 3 or 4 foot terrarium indefinitely is simply unacceptable. Letting them run around the house is also not a solution to that particular problem. Second big problem with most bearded dragon enclosures is the thermal environment. Now most people think they're doing the right thing by putting a heat source at one end, creating a thermal gradient, whacking in a thermostat to stop the whole thing from overheating, and that's all they have to do. Well, that's a very crude approach to thermoregulation. The big problem is that while it has a range of temperatures the animal can select from, it remains static. The animal doesn't have to move around much, if at all. That's not what happens in the wild. The animal needs to chase the sun throughout the day so it can heat up and cool down as it needs to. So we need to be trying to replicate that. The big problem with not doing that is that inactivity itself creates a whole host of problems for bearded dragons, and we'll get to that a bit later in the video. Issue number 3 is hydration and humidity.
Inland bearded dragons live in the driest part of the driest inhabited continent on Earth. They're very good at retaining hydration, and they can't cope with excessive humidity, but excessive humidity is often what they get in captive environments. The biggest cause is that big shallow water bowl sitting at one end of the enclosure. It is evaporating water at an incredible rate, and it is raising the humidity in that enclosure to a point that the bearded dragon cannot cope with in the long term. High humidity causes a whole range of health issues, particularly respiratory infections and trouble with shedding skin. Okay, issue number 4 with most bearded dragon enclosures is aesthetics, and this is somewhat subjective, but as I said in the beginning, I see these animals as works of art forged in the furnace of nature, and that their accommodation should reflect that. But unfortunately, most bearded dragon enclosures, most reptile enclosures don't reflect anything like the natural habitat that these animals occur in. And that's an area that the reptile hobby is really lagging in compared to, say, the aquarium scene. I absolutely cringe at most of the reptile enclosures I see out there, and it's just an area where the reptile community really needs to lift their game. While we're talking about aesthetics, if you have a little plastic cactus in the corner of your bearded dragon enclosure, if you could just go and get it now and take it over to the bin and throw it away. If you have a live cactus in your bearded dragon enclosure, that's even worse. There are no native cacti in Australia, and a live cactus actually presents a real risk of injury to your bearded dragon, so get rid of it. Okay, let's move on to this build and how it attempts to address some of those issues that we've just discussed. Firstly, size. This one's around 4 cubic meters in volume, and that should be adequate for our bearded dragon. Notice I'm talking about volume, cubic meters, not square meters. Bearded dragons don't just need a space on the ground, they are arboreal and they need to be able to climb. They need plenty of vertical spaces in which to explore. And that's why the Tibooburra rocky outcrops around the dome were absolutely perfect as our inspiration for this build, because those rocky outcrops provide cover, they provide places to climb, and the thermal inertia of those rocks, they keep radiating heat right into the night, so they're really cool. I actually filmed the first part of the video at Tibooburra in winter, so I didn't see any bearded dragons around the dome, but I was lucky enough to get back there at the beginning of spring this year, and it was absolutely crawling with bearded dragons. Every one of those rocky outcrops had a resident, at least one resident bearded dragon, so it was quite impressive to see. So the second area we had to address was the thermal environment. Remember, we don't want a static thermal environment. The static thermal environment means an animal that doesn't have to move around very much, an animal that doesn't move much, doesn't burn many calories. An animal that doesn't burn many calories quickly gets fat. Obesity is a massive killer of captive reptiles, and the bearded dragon is no exception. But there are other issues with the static environment too. If the animal doesn't have to move much, the claws get exceedingly long, exceedingly quickly. But a bigger issue is the femoral paws on the underside of the hind limbs on a bearded dragon. Those femoral paws, particularly in males, get quite large, and they exude a waxy substance. That's the stuff you can see sticking out. As the animal moves along, it leaves behind a residue, and the animals use that to communicate. They mark their territory with it. When you see a bearded dragon run along and lick the ground, one of the things it's looking for is evidence of other bearded dragons through residue from those femoral paws. Now, if the animal doesn't move much, it is not constantly dragging those paws along and pulling off some of that wax, and it can quickly get to a point where it builds up and can even become infected and need to be treated by a vet. So there's a whole range of issues that happen with a static thermal environment. So what I've done here is implemented what I call a DHR, or a dynamic heating regime.
So we will have here multiple heat sources. There will be radiant heat sources, 2 in the ceiling, each accompanied by ultraviolet. Another radiant heat source concealed in the rockwork here, beaming down onto the rock below, additional ultraviolet there as well. There's also these heat cables on 2 positions, and all of these heat sources and ultraviolet sources can be independently controlled via a smart switch. So it's a simple case of going through on your phone using an app to set a schedule, and you can replicate something akin to what happens during the day when the animal has to move around, follow the sun around in and out of the shade, and it's a much closer simulation of a natural thermal environment where the animal has to actively move around in the enclosure to access the temperature that it needs at that particular time.
As an example of thermoregulation in action in the wild, here's another Tibibara bearded dragon. This one is cleverly using these vertical branches to get the perfect angle to capture the very last rays of the setting sun.
Another thing we didn't talk about earlier was the contribution that our manner of feeding our reptiles can have to obesity. So most people simply feed their animal a bowlless feed, a whole heap of food at once, in a bowl, or feeding by hand at regular intervals, maybe once a week or once every couple of days, depending on the time of year. That's not the way these animals get food in the wild. Feeding is opportunistic and very intermittent. So what I've done here is create a little insect distribution system. There's a little concealed compartment out the front there, a rockwork door that opens up to reveal a couple of items there. One is a box that can be filled with crickets, and the crickets from there can gradually disperse into the enclosure via a network of tubing. This way the animal is going to be presented with food intermittently and sporadically, just as something like what would happen in the wild. And it means that, again, the animal has an opportunity to hunt, so there's some enrichment and an opportunity to get some exercise. So issue number 3 we had to address was hydration and humidity. We talked about how those big shallow water bowls at the end of a bearded dragon enclosure contribute to excessive humidity in the enclosure. What I've done here is reverse the dimensions of the water container. So I have a very large enclosure, and the water bowl is this tiny little pipe down here. So it's quite deep, but there's very little surface area on top, and that's going to mean that that water is going to radiate very little humidity back into the enclosure. Now, with bearded dragons in the wild, opportunities to drink are actually very rare. So it rains very rarely, so they can drink then, but otherwise they're looking for condensation. So sometimes in the morning there'll be enough condensation that water droplets will form on surfaces, say on rocks or grasses, and the bearded dragon will look for those water droplets, and moving water actually triggers them far more than static water to go and have a drink. So what I've done here is create a little dripper system. So right above our water well we have a little dripper, and that is controlled again via a smart switch. There's a second water reservoir down in our little service portal, and that pumps water back up here. So the animal will see that water trickling down, and it should trigger it to go and take a drink. And again, we're simply trying to replicate as closely as we can what occurs in nature. So that whole system, once it reaches the top level there, it actually overflows and most of the water is recovered back into the holding tank, and the whole system can be drained out as needed. And in case you're wondering, yes, that is a windscreen washer reservoir originally designed for a car, but it works perfectly in this application. So that's the hydration taken care of. What about the humidity? Well, we talked about humidity being bad for bearded dragons. They're from the desert. They cannot handle excessive humidity. And one of the biggest issues is respiratory conditions.
There's a whole host of respiratory problems bearded dragons can have due to excess humidity, and many of them are deadly. So what have we done here? We've actually brought in the big guns. I've installed a dehumidifier, quite a large one. It connects into the enclosure via some ducting, which is concealed below the rockwork here. The dehumidifier will run constantly and can be emptied out via a little reservoir, or if the room it goes to is equipped with a drain, it can be set up to run continuously and drain continuously. All right, so that is it for the life support systems. The next stage we wanted to talk about before was aesthetics, but before I can demonstrate what we've done there, I'm going to have to get into finishing off the rockwork. Okay, and here we are with our faux Tibooburra granodiorite rocky outcrop complete. Now you'll notice by now that I'm using steel throughout the construction of the exhibit, and there's a number of reasons for this. The first one is its sheer strength. So it's strong enough that I can make a steel frame to support this particular type of flexible render that I like to use. Number two, it can be shaped into a limitless range of curves and angles, so you can actually try and replicate the geology that you're trying to simulate. At Tibooburra, the rocks were almost, they looked tortured. You know, there was all these endless cycles over the millennia of heating and cooling. You could actually see that in all the cracks and shears in the rocks there. So I've tried to replicate some of that here. The third reason is it's hollow. So with a steel wireframe, you've got plenty of space inside the rockwork to actually fit it out with all of the required life support systems. So the ducting for the humidifier, all of the electrics, and all of the plumbing for the water reticulation system fits neatly concealed inside the rockwork. So the steel extends beyond just the rockwork frame. The entire frame of the exhibit is also made of steel. And one of the great advantages there is that the viewing panels, the frames for those, are very thin, so it provides a view into the enclosure that's mostly uninterrupted. One of the really cool things about steel is that it allows us to be much more creative in the overall design of the exterior of the exhibit. We get away from boring rectangular boxes. So in this case, this is designed as a corner unit, and the view in around this central rocky feature changes across 90 degrees, so it's quite immersive. Okay, let's talk through the features I've included in the rockwork to help make this the perfect home for a bearded dragon. So the central feature is this narrow boulder jutting out into the center of the enclosure. This is one of those classic vantage points that bearded dragons just love in the wild. They like to be up high and able to survey their surroundings so they can see opportunities to feed, and they can also get a view of any predators that might be approaching, and they can get out of the way long before they get too close. This is also our primary basking point. Remember, it's heated from within with those heating cables. We've also got our radiant heat and ultraviolet overhead. If the animal wants to get an even higher vantage point, it can move up onto this bleached mulga branch, and of course we'll be able to encourage those shifts in behaviour through our dynamic heating regime system. Now, at the base of the main basking rock here is the first of two hide areas. So I've sculpted a little cave in under this boulder, and that will provide something similar to the kind of spaces that the animals would be looking for to hide in and feel safe in the wild. There's also another one below. The difference between the two is this higher one is actually at a higher humidity. Now, we know that we want to maintain very low humidity throughout the enclosure, but it's also not a bad idea to provide one space that has a slightly higher humidity. Reason for that is in the wild, occasionally bearded dragons will seek out areas of higher humidity by digging underground and reaching spaces that have lower temperatures and high humidities, and they might do that for specific reasons, such as aiding in the shedding of their skin. So while we do want to maintain quite low humidity through the bulk of the enclosure, it is a good idea to have one space that is at a higher humidity, just in case the animal, for whatever reason, wants to seek out those particular conditions. So to achieve that, I have located the hide area adjacent to our water well and dripping system, and the air pushed into the enclosure from below here out of the dehumidifier circulates through the enclosure, passes by here, circulates through the hide area, carrying water from that evaporation off the well, and then that's drawn around the back of the rockwork here and returns to the dehumidifier via the return vent at the back of the rockwork there. Finally, it's worth talking about the finished texture that we have. We talked earlier about how important it was to recreate the kind of surfaces the animal would find in the wild, and this flexible render is just perfect for that. It has just the right level of abrasiveness that those claws and femoral paws will wear down adequately as the animal moves around. And it also provides a lot of purchase for the animal. It's able to climb around all of these surfaces safely without slipping off. I can't begin to tell you how much it annoys me to see bearded dragons kept on completely inappropriate substrates in their enclosures. I'll give you two examples. One would be anything smooth and slippery. So things like hard slate and plastics. They can be very convenient for the keeper because they're easy to clean, but it leads to an absolutely miserable existence for the animal because it can't get any grip on it whatsoever. These are animals that climb and explore, and they just can't do it on those surfaces. And add to that, anything soft. I see people putting in carpet and soft toweling for their bearded dragons. It's the ultimate in anthropomorphism. If you don't know what that means, maybe you need to get another hobby. But those surfaces are actually quite dangerous for the animal. Ask your vet how many times they've seen a bearded dragon with its digits actually ripped off from being tangled up in the fibres of those materials. So smooth surfaces and soft things can go in the bin with the cactus. Alright, it's time to keep moving and try and push this project over the finish line. And I'm going to move on now to our piste de resistance, which is another feature that's inspired by our beautiful location out at Tibooburra. My approach to building homes for reptiles is always to deep dive into the evolutionary forces that have shaped them. Does my design truly reflect the animal's natural habitat? Have I thought of the full range of physical and behavioural needs of the animal and developed technical solutions to these? I constantly ask myself whether or not my designs do their best at addressing these questions. But I'll admit I'm never completely satisfied with the result. There's always something I try differently next time. But I do hope this approach inspires others to try and do the same. Too often reptiles are kept in an environment that is just barely enough to keep them alive, and rarely does an understanding of its evolutionary history play the role in the design that it truly deserves. And here it is. After several months, the final pieces of the build have pulled together. Let's run through the features of the finished product. The enclosure utilises a steel frame and rolls on heavy-duty braked casters to make it easy to position and transport. It is designed to fit left-hand into corner with life support systems accessed through a portal in the rear. All lighting, heating and water reticulation is managed by 2 banks of smart switches regulated by a smartphone app. A dehumidifier is ducted into the enclosure to maintain arid conditions, and a water well and dripper is incorporated into the rockwork to visually trigger a natural drinking response. A live insect distribution system introduces prey items into the enclosure intermittently, enriching the animal by providing hunting opportunities. 2 hide spaces are sculpted into the rockwork with a humidity difference of around 10% to accommodate humidity regulation behaviours. Lighting and heating incorporates a dynamic heating regime. This maximises activity to benefit exercise and natural wear of claws and femoral paws. Powerful T5 UVB emitters ensure adequate synthesis of vitamin D3. All of the surfaces in the enclosure promote tractability for the animal and are easily cleaned. Humidity and temperature sensors enable the exhibit manager to monitor and regulate the enclosure from anywhere on Earth. And finally, the exhibit aims to faithfully recreate one of the inland bearded dragon's favourite habitats, the beautiful granodiorite outcrops of the Tibooburra Dome in far western New South Wales. And the piece de resistance, you ask? Well, it's an illuminated backdrop featuring the stunning skyline of the Tibooburra Dome. The backdrop is backlit by 10 metres of adjustable LED lighting, which can simulate sunrise, sunset, moonlight and endless colour combinations in between. If you'd like to see more of this content, please like and subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another exhibit. The next reptile is actually a really tiny one, but it's an absolute jewel of the desert. Thanks for watching.